لهم حديد ونار لهم حديد ونار وهم من القش أضعف.
So on to what changed in our outlook. Of course, we're working on different projects today to what we were a decade ago. In March 2011, you were talking about a manifesto for political change, and that's what we first got talking about. But that's no longer what we've been focused on for the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, the moment that you mentioned really was around March of 2011, when I started to kind of collect ideas for what I call the Arab Spring Manifesto. And really, the story for that is that as starting from December of 2010, we had a series of uprisings in the Arab region. Culminating, of course, you had the Tunisian uprising, then you had the Egyptian uprising, and then you had uprisings and protest movements across the region. And I was initially involved in coverage. That was what I did almost full time. But then around March is when I started to realize that, we have all of this demand for change, and we have this kind of political opening, but we don't have a manifesto. We don't have ideas about what does if this order is collapsing, what does the next order look like, not only in the region but internationally. And that's what got us thinking. I mean, it was within that context of writing that book that we met and we started talking and we started collaborating. I feel that between 2011 and 2013, I considered myself not really, I consider myself an ideas guy. I considered that I'm here to think of those ideas to create a manifesto for what this region can be. It was kind of interrupted by so many big, huge things happening, both personally and in the region. But I feel like now we're kind of back there. We're kind of back to a similar moment where, earlier today I was thinking about this Egyptian song, or revolutionary song. I don't remember when it was written, but I'll say it in Arabic. It says, أنا الشعب ماشي وعارف طريقي. It means I am the people. It's basically talking on behalf of the people. I am the people. I'm walking forward or moving forward, and I know where I'm heading. The subtext for that is, when people don't know where they're heading, they don't really raise a finger. I mean, when people know, when there's a vision, when there is a manifesto, when people know that, okay, this is what we're working for, this is what we're aiming for, and it's something specific, something beautiful, something inspiring, but something also strategically sound, they will amaze you with their sacrifice if there is a national vision or a regional vision. If they don't, then they're not really going to raise a finger. And so I feel like we're back to this moment where we really need to put in a lot of intellectual effort into kind of doing this kind of work that we were supposed to do, or we wanted to do back 10 years ago, but maybe this is the right time to do it.
Basically figuring out a vision for what the future should look like and how we build societies post-authoritarianism and how we get them to work sustainably.
But we're not talking only about the region, though. We're talking about, a lot of our thinking have been about economics, about post-capitalist economics, because we feel that in many of these crises, you kind of try to analyze it, and there's this technique where you ask 5 whys, why and then why and why 5 times to get to the root cause, or at least near the root cause of any problem. You always find that neoliberal economics is somewhere there. Austerity economics is somewhere there. Economic inequality is somewhere there. So I think that, and this, by the way, drives our interest in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin specifically also, is because it's kind of part of a kind of a mind map where we're talking about, we're thinking about post-capitalist economics.
Yeah, so basically, as part of a vision for the future of the region, you have to have a sustainable order which won't just lead to what's happened everywhere in the world so far, which is, you can create a democratic order, but you just get widening inequality, massively widening inequality, a precariat of society who are barely making it, and then effectively an oligarchy who are buying control of politics, even in countries which score highly on democratic indices. That's not a vision that inspires people. Like, if you tell people our vision is to be, for example, like the UK or to be like the US, that's not massively inspiring in the 21st century, because these are also dysfunctional countries which aren't really living up to the promise of democracy anymore, and aren't giving a lot of their populations, the life of dignity that is aspired to.
It's interesting you'd say that, because when I recorded, I looked much younger, I looked very different back then, but I recorded a couple videos in 2011 where I was giving kind of an introduction to why this Arab Spring Manifesto is needed. And what I said is that, for many people, especially Western observers, they're like, okay, these guys are now going to adopt Western style political and economic systems. Even back then, it did not look very attractive, because, to me, looking at back then, I'm like, this is like, they don't have their shit together. But then, of course, many people didn't like that I was saying that, because because this is the best that, supposedly this is the best that humanity has to offer in terms of governance and economics, etc. Now it's much more manifest.
Yeah, but I think we've always occupied this kind of more radical position where we're not just aiming for improved human rights protections. We're not just aiming for, improved rule of law or electoral democracy. We want some quite radical overhaul in the way the system works entirely, because we think, what exists today and what's aspired to today as the standard of progressive governance and democracy, etc., is basically the culmination of ideas which came from the founding of the US back 300 years ago, is it? 250 years ago. And some of those ideas were incredible leaps forward for humanity, but they've run their course, and we're now clinging on to them because we're afraid to say that, something has to be next. Humanity's always moved from paradigm to paradigm. And as we do that, we always gain a greater insight into the flaws of society, the power imbalances, the inequalities, and the way the way that the actual vision and the ideal doesn't work. And then we've used that to build the next paradigm and to build the next system and the next idea and move on. And now we're basically faced with this position where the contemporary paradigm is breaking, but it's also being held up by many as the only alternative to authoritarianism. And the core of our radicalism is that we basically reject that and say, as a human race, we can do better than that.
Yeah, and I would just add that even though the current paradigm is Western dominated and Western constructed, Western dominated, and it also carries within it Western supremacism. Even though there's also an untold story. There's the other story that is now being told, especially by decolonial thinkers, by minorities, by Black American radicals, by people from the global South, who are for the first time getting the platform to challenge the dominant story that was like I said, for a very long time Western dominated. It's messy, but it's exciting, to be honest. And all of this happening has really important implications for human rights. I remember I tweeted this a few days ago. I said so. I'm paraphrasing myself here. I said all human rights work before this moment, in the last 20 years, even longer, happened under this implicit assumption that there was a global order that kind of upholds or implements human rights, or at least influences or supports, etc., human rights. And of course, the idea here is that I don't think it actually did. I'm Palestinian. I can tell you that it was always hypocritical. But again, there was this assumption, right? It worked at least for some people, or at least it told itself that it worked. And I believe that in the next 20 years, maybe even longer, we have to kind of develop new models, because we cannot have that assumption that there is such a global order that that can enforce anything or can support anything. And we can see a lot of the disappointments that we have, a lot of the WTF moments that we have, really is stemming from some of those actors on the world stage trying to adapt themselves to a new reality. And in many cases, human rights are being as forgotten now as they were forgotten before. But this is why we have been talking a lot within our team, but also with our partners, with our comrades, etc., about power building. because we have this perspective, and I think you will have a lot to say about that, Ahmed, that post-liberal world order, we need to be in power building mode, because if you don't have, like, the way that we do human rights activism, or whatever you call it, I don't think even, I think we have to like grow out of the word even human rights activism. We have to be talking about liberation rather than human rights, because I think even human rights will bring forth this assumption that there's a machinery that implements it, and that machinery doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, so one thing we've been talking about with a lot of frustration for a long time, you actually told me a while ago that you, coming out of lockdown, you were getting really frustrated because you were getting to meet people again. And as you were doing that, you were realizing how much you'd changed and how little a lot of other people had. But we've been talking about this idea embedded in activism, in a lot of activism for a very long time, that the way you achieve change is to basically plead with powers on the global stage to implement that change for you, to look after you, to protect your rights, to punish your oppressors, to come to your rescue. You petition the United Nations, you petition different international organizations, you petition governments, etc. And really we're coming to the point where it's becoming difficult for anybody to deny that this isn't working. Arguably it never worked, but it's definitely not working now, and it's mostly a waste of time and a waste of resources, and not to mention it's very undignified. You kind of feel like you're begging, and you're not getting anywhere. And what we need to move to is a model whereby we actually look for the things we can implement directly ourselves. You say power building. There are ways in which we can build economic power in order to fund our activism and to fund our institutions alone rather than relying on grants and donations. There are models of building social power by changing the way our communities come together and work. There are ways of organizing our communities. There are ways of strategizing and building strategies for resisting oppression. And all of this is stuff that can be done by the people themselves rather than depending on higher powers to intervene on their behalf. And this is just a culture that needs to become dominant in the human rights community, because we're past the point of thinking that the US cares about human rights on the global level, or the United Nations is ever going to break out of its inaction.
I mean, of course, I would temper that by saying that we're not saying that it is not useful to sometimes engage governments. It's just that there is a limitation now. There's a political limitation, but there's also a practical limitation about what they can even do. I mean, even if they listen to us and follow our advice, which they mostly don't and won't, there's still a practical limit about what they can do.
And even then, they mostly act out of self-interest. They don't actually work, out of the goodness of their hearts. Politics is a self-interested game. But it's fine to pressure politicians when you have an actual theory of change and a model which says we exert this pressure, we force these people to act because this pressure does this to them, and therefore we achieve this end. It's another thing to just reflexively say we have to take these causes to the UN and we have to speak about them, etc. They're very different ways of thinking.
Yeah, and I think, while you were speaking, of course, you mentioned building social power. And in many of our conversations, we come back to this point, which is that community building is one of the biggest power builders. And I wanted to comment here that in our analysis, and of course we've been engaged in this for a long time, and we've seen how there are certain spaces where the activists themselves, who are working in a specific context, specific country, don't talk to each other because there's a lot of, lots of, bad blood between them, lots of egos in a lot of these fields. I think a lot of the in many cases the funding ecosystem itself creates kind of competition rather than collaboration. It's not all, of course, some funders go out of their way to actually build alliances, but also there's some funders that actually do the opposite. But this is actually what drove our interest in trauma and trauma recovery, and PTSD, and of course in breakthrough treatments for this, particularly of course psychedelic medications and the promise of what they can do. This is of course science based. It is exciting, And I believe that a lot of I mean, I started talking about trauma as an undisclosed or unexamined dimension of history, and about our region, the Middle East or North Africa, as absolutely overflowing with trauma and traumatized people, and how we can't really understand why people act the way they do, why people adopt the ideologies they do, and why it's difficult to get even people who should be allies to work together if we don't really understand trauma and if we don't have any initiatives targeting trauma. So
It's basically an underlying and unexamined cause of a lot of relationship and organizational, institutional, social dysfunction. You have systems that don't work the way they should, and it's really not clear why they don't work the way they should until you realize that all of the people within the system are very deeply traumatized, and probably most of them don't understand the extent of their trauma, but it drives their actions and it drives their emotions.
yeah, and I think I mean we've been kind of discussing this among ourselves, because we have enough interest in this field, and we're going to have enough of an investment in this field, that we even considered having a podcast specifically just to talk about trauma and trauma recovery and highlighting stories of trauma recovery. But it could also be that a lot of our upcoming episodes on the Arab Tyrant Manual are going to be examining the impact of trauma on the political ecosystem. Again, I think that this is an unexplored, under-examined dimension of not only politics but history in general.
Yeah, I can see you making notes on the side about trauma, decolonial history, the world and human rights, post-liberal world order, China, the Great US Withdrawal, NSO Group, the Abraham Accords, like all these tangents coming off this discussion, because it feels like we're trying to cram 2 years into a single conversation, and it's obviously ridiculous.
I mean, the whole idea. I mean, when I pitched the idea of this episode to you, I'm like, let's just hit record and start talking, and maybe we'll end up with, 2 recordings. Maybe we'll end up splitting this into 2 episodes. But to wrap up with, our perspective and what has changed and what we're bringing into building our organization, I believe that we are working at a time of history where we're at the precipice of so many paradigm shifts, and we're working at the intersection of all of this. So if we're talking about economic paradigms, we're talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and post-capitalist economics. If we're talking about fossil fuels, it seems that we're also entering a transition. If we're talking about Western supremacy or Western style democracy, inequality, etc., it seems that all of these things are way past a correction. And so our work is going to be at this intersection continuously. We're not saying, of course, that traditional human rights work, like documentation, like advocacy, like boycotts, like the traditional work that human rights activists, many brilliant people continue to do. We're not saying it's unimportant, but we're saying that it's no longer the only work that is needed. It is important, but it's not sufficient. And if we want to leave our mark on the field, we're going to have to, put ourselves in a different space.
Yeah, so basically what we're looking at is paradigm changes and potentially transformative systems and ideas. And basically it's going to be a very interesting 2022 at Kawakibi Foundation and on the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast.
Yeah, I mean, let's end on this particular note. Maybe we speak a little bit about the podcast and what we have in mind for it, and not just the podcast really, but our media output from here on. I mean, we mentioned it, of course, at the beginning of this recording. We talked about how there's another podcast coming. This is going to be sort of more regular. But then I asked myself this question a lot, like, what set us apart? We launched the Arab Tyrant Manual in November of 2017. And we had a really interesting and really powerful audience, because we had people from within the region, people from outside the region. We had people who are interested in the strategy, people who are interested in the story. But maybe I'll throw this question to you, Ahmed. Like, what set us apart? What made this podcast and this project unique?
Yeah, I've been wrestling with this question for a while, because I didn't want to actually restart until we had an answer, because there's a lot of podcasts these days who just look at authoritarianism and the fight against authoritarianism, and I think we did more than that. you've mentioned that it's possibly the fact that we have skin in the game, that we're from the region and highly invested in it, and we actually care. We're not just, conflict observers. But I think it's probably our focus on the future and not just the past. We bring hope, but it's like a rational and level-headed hope, not just blind hope. It keeps us insulated from cynicism, and we're always looking at ways that the story can change, and not just telling the story as it is.
I think in many cases it's not as useful to over obsess about this question of like, how are you different? I think we just do what we do, and we let our we let our instinct, and we let our fans and our followers and our audience kind of lead us. So we want to make you guys part of the conversation. And so we do have, one of the most exciting things about 2022 is really the community engagement initiatives that we have. And I'll invite you, Ahmed, because you're the one who worked on planning this. I invite you to speak a little bit about that.
So I guess when we finalize it, it'll be in the episode description, and we'll be tweeting about it, etc. So that's where the final word will be. But we're basically planning for this podcast to be every 2 weeks, an episode every 2 weeks, and in between that we'll be doing either a Twitter live or something on Discord to basically discuss the episode and the themes within it in more detail with our supporters. And we'll see how it goes from there, because we have ideas of a newsletter. We have ideas of more live events. We have ideas of doing more video content. And it all depends on what people want to see most, I guess.
And I mean, of course, there are new tools that didn't exist 2 years ago, like, Twitter Spaces or Clubhouse, etc. And that's also, live audio is, I think, it's still untapped. I think it became very popular, but I think that it can become even more popular. So I think this is also an opportunity for us to kind of engage directly, because a lot of our engagement has been either slow format, which is a podcast, or in instant format, being Twitter, tweet something out. I think it's also important to build more of a community and find more ways to engage our audience. As for, the schedule, like you mentioned, the schedule kind of reflects that, because we could have said, we have the capacity to do an episode every week, but then if you have only 1 week between episodes, you don't really get enough time to talk about it and discuss it before the next one. And so I think this kind of works better. But if I'm looking forward at the next few episodes, you mentioned a few of those things, which, I kind of noted down, because there's always things that we can branch into from this discussion. But I think it's going to be a mix between the deep dive episodes and between interviews on the topic. We're also going to be, using this episode in a certain way, this conversation kind of as an index to kind of jump into chapter liberal world order, chapter NSO, etc. But in general, this is what we're really obsessing about: how the world is changing, what it means for our work, and what it means for our part of the world. And what is the long-term outlook? Especially the long-term. When we say long-term, we're talking 20-year. But also we're working on some, on making our content more accessible. And maybe you know more about this than me.
I want to push back on the long-term being 20-year. I think 20-year is the midterm, and I think we've been really changing our perspective on what the long-term is. We have this mental bias where we always think of humanity as a timeline, and we're the final point on that timeline. And that's actually completely not true, because, when you think about how long humanity could potentially be around, there's going to be people in the future to whom we are considered, closer to the era of the biblical prophets than to the present day. We're going to be ancient forefathers, and you have that butterfly effect magnified through the ages, where even small changes we make to the way the world works today could be massively magnified generations down the line in the future. And it's really short-sighted to only think about things in, the 5-year, 10-year timescale, when actually the systems that we are building now are going to be, they're going to affect the way the world works generations down the line for billions and billions of human beings. We're talking about things like the US withdrawal from large parts of the world, and a reduction in US power and rebalancing of the world order and a multipolar world. That's not something we're going to fully see in our lifetimes, but that does mean that in a century or in 2 centuries, the world is going to look very radically different. If you look at how different the world was 3 or 4 centuries ago and what power looked like, it's almost incomparable to today. And we're looking at changes of similar magnitude in the future, and we're kind of trying to not just predict the way the world is going, but we're trying to have some small part in it, and we're trying to push in the direction that we want the boulder to roll.
I mean, someone asked me today about hope. I was doing like a quick Ask Me Anything. And I mentioned, that hope is not really about things, it's not about optimism or pessimism. It's really about doing the work. It's about, saying that some things are meaningful enough that we can spend many years doing it. And it's interesting that you'd say, I'm very, very pleased really with your answer. It's interesting that, we have this kind of long-term perspective, because a few weeks ago I was at a coffee shop, and I think, meeting a friend, and this idea came up, like, what's your 20-year outlook? And you're talking about 7 generations, 10 generations down the line, even maybe more. And, the person is like, 20 years, is that going to be the day of judgment? I mean, it's like almost like there's no future anymore, and nothing matters when we don't have to think strategically anymore. But yeah, I mean, this is exciting, to be honest. It's exciting to think, to have this hopeful view that, history doesn't stop here, and we have to look beyond the present moment.
So we have that term, that much maligned term, the end of history, and I think we should actually flip it, and if no one else has done it yet, we should coin the beginning of history and say, humanity is still in its infancy and everything is yet to come.
I mean, the day zero, kind of the day one kind of attitude, it starts here. There's always a story that's starting here. And with that, I think I want to talk a bit about our media mix and how we're going to make our content more accessible. Because for the longest time, the Arab Tyrant Manual was a podcast released on major podcast, software. And now we're kind of like going beyond that, because we're also adding the video. The idea of the video here is really driven by this desire to actually get on YouTube. There was always this problem, the discoverability problem, which is that, we could have really good content from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, because a lot of our content really is evergreen. But then nobody sees it, because it just rolls down your timeline. You don't see it again, except if you actually explicitly look for it. I believe that YouTube is one of those organizations that kind of, one of those platforms that actually solve the discoverability problem, because I regularly see, videos suggested to me that might be 8 years old, 10 years old, based upon simply the recommendation engine. So that was really the motivation, at least my motivation, for getting on YouTube. You get you get introduced to another audience, but maybe we get, I know that we're always going to be learning. The first episode of anything, even a reset, is going to be, learning, and we're always learning. And I know we're going to suck at this video thing initially. But then, maybe we get good at it.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty safe bet that we're going to suck initially. But we'll keep at it this time.
That's the idea. I mean, I can't believe, you put our faces, side by side, and like we have friends who keep saying that you guys look the same. I don't think we do, especially that you're a bit taller than me. And I'm a bit older than you, but it's basically 2 Arab bald bearded guys, side by side.
Well, maybe we'll diversify at some point as well. That's been part of our discussions recently. But I think we should call it a day here, because it's been a long conversation.
Yeah, and I do want to thank our audience, of course, for being part of this journey. The Arab Tyrant Manual started in 2017, and we're 4 years later. Personally, for me, 2017 was also when I started my PTSD recovery journey. It's when I started seeking therapy, I think in the same month. And so a lot has changed over these 4 years, and I hope that this podcast will be with you for a long time.
Yeah, and you can find us on Twitter. You can also find us on Patreon, and if you sign up to one of the Patreon tiers, you basically get access into the Discord where we're going to be hanging out. Discord's a chat platform in case you've never used it. Kind of like Slack, but more fun. It has audio channels as well as text, and we're going to be using it for Q&As and, exclusive announcements of episodes before they're released, and other pieces of work as well. So please join us there because your support means a lot. We ran this organization for years solely off of Patreon donations, which is an incredible run, and long may it continue.
And I'll just add that, because, it's only going to be a small number of people on the Discord initially, these people are going to get a lot of access to us. So, maybe that's a good motivation for you guys to actually join as soon as possible.
So it's going to be an exciting 22. See you in the new year, Iyad.
See you too. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
يا مصطفى يا كتابا من كل قلب تألف ويا زمانا سيأتي